RCA Studio B, Nashville, Tennessee. October 15th, 3:47 a.m. The red recording light had been off for 23 minutes, but Elvis Presley still sat motionless in the vocal booth, his head buried in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. Behind the glass, producer Felton Jarvis exchanged worried glances with guitarist James Burton and pianist David Briggs. In 15 years of recording with Elvis, none of them had ever witnessed anything like what had just happened. They had come to Nashville to cut another album of standard material safe, commercial songs that would satisfy RCA's demands and Elvis's Vegas audience. Instead, they had just witnessed the most emotionally devastating performance any of them would ever hear. The song that had reduced the king of rock and roll to tears was My Way, Paul Anka's adaptation of the French song Comme d'habitude, that had become Frank Sinatra's signature anthem of defiant individualism. But in Elvis's hands, the song had become something else entirely. A brutally honest confession, a painful self-examination, and a prophecy of loneliness that was almost too personal to bear. "That's it," Elvis finally said, his voice hoarse and broken as he looked up at the control room. "Lock it away. Nobody ever hears this." Nobody. Those words would seal the fate of what many consider Elvis Presley's greatest vocal performance, a recording so emotionally raw and psychologically revealing that it would remain buried in RCA's vaults for decades. Too powerful and too personal for the world to hear during Elvis's lifetime. This is the documented story of the song that haunted Elvis Presley, the recording that revealed too much truth about the man behind the legend, and the performance that was so emotionally devastating that Elvis himself declared it too dangerous to release. The story of Elvis and My Way begins not in 1971, but 3 years earlier, when Paul Anka first played the song for Frank Sinatra in a Beverly Hills restaurant. Sinatra had been looking for material that would capture his philosophy of life, the idea that success meant living according to your own rules, facing challenges with dignity, and maintaining control over your own destiny. Anka's English adaptation of Claude François' French composition perfectly captured Sinatra's persona. The song's message of self-determination and unapologetic individualism matched Sinatra's public image as a man who had achieved everything on his own terms, who had faced down critics and obstacles through sheer force of will and talent. When Sinatra recorded My Way in March 1969, it became an instant classic and his signature song. The recording captured everything that made Sinatra compelling: his sophisticated phrasing, his emotional intelligence, and his ability to inhabit a song's meaning while maintaining the cool distance that was essential to his persona. But My Way was more than just another song in Sinatra's catalog. It became an anthem for a generation of Americans who had lived through the Depression, World War II, and the social upheavals of the 1960s. The song spoke to people who had survived difficult times through personal strength and determination, who had made their own rules when the old rules no longer applied. For Elvis Presley, watching Sinatra's success with My Way, from his increasingly isolated position as the king of Las Vegas entertainment, the song represented something both appealing and terrifying. On one level, My Way seemed perfect for Elvis, a powerful ballad that would showcase his vocal abilities while allowing him to make a statement about his own career and philosophy. But on a deeper level, My Way posed challenges that Elvis wasn't sure he was ready to face. The song demanded complete honesty from its performer, requiring them to examine their life choices with unflinching clarity. For someone whose public image had been carefully constructed and maintained for over 15 years, that level of emotional transparency was both appealing and dangerous. Elvis first mentioned wanting to record My Way in late 1969, during one of his early Las Vegas residencies at the International Hotel. According to Charlie Hodge, who served as Elvis's onstage assistant and close friend, Elvis had been listening to Sinatra's version repeatedly and talking about how he might approach the song differently. Elvis was fascinated by what Frank had done with My Way, but he also thought he could bring something different to it, Hodge recalled in a 1988 interview. Elvis saw the song as a chance to really say something about his own journey, his own experiences. But I could also see that it made him nervous in a way that other songs didn't. The nervousness, Hodge observed, came from Elvis's growing awareness that My Way would require him to confront aspects of his career and personal life that he had spent years avoiding. Unlike the love songs and gospel numbers that dominated his repertoire, My Way was explicitly autobiographical, demanding that its performer take responsibility for their choices and acknowledge both their triumphs and their regrets. For Elvis, who had always been somewhat passive about his career direction, allowing Colonel Parker and RCA to make most of the major decisions about his professional life, the song's emphasis on self-determination was both inspiring and accusatory. Could someone who had allowed others to shape his career for decades honestly claim to have done things his way? The decision to finally record My Way came during a particularly reflective period in Elvis's life. By 1971, he had been performing in Las Vegas for 2 years, and the initial excitement of returning to live performance had given way to a more complex set of emotions about his career and personal life. The Vegas residencies had been artistically and commercially successful, proving that Elvis could still command audiences and generate enormous revenues, but the routine of performing the same songs night after night in the same venue had begun to feel limiting rather than liberating. Elvis was starting to question whether his return to live performance had actually expanded his artistic possibilities or simply created a more comfortable prison. His personal life was also undergoing significant changes. His marriage to Priscilla was showing increasing strain as Elvis's demanding performance schedule and lifestyle made normal domestic life almost impossible. Lisa Marie, born in 1968, was growing up in an environment where her father was more legend than parent, available for brief periods between tours and recording sessions. Most troubling for Elvis was his growing awareness that his career had become formulaic and predictable. The spontaneity and creative risk-taking that had made him famous seemed to have been replaced by a careful calculation of what audiences expected from Elvis Presley. He was becoming a tribute act to himself, performing versions of his own songs that satisfied audience expectations while providing little personal or artistic satisfaction. It was in this frame of mind that Elvis approached My Way in October 1971. The recording session was originally scheduled to focus on material for a Christmas album, but Elvis arrived at the studio with a different agenda. He had been thinking about My Way for months, and he was finally ready to attempt a version that would be truly his own. The session began normally, with Elvis working through several conventional ballads and up-tempo numbers that would satisfy RCA's commercial requirements. But as the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the studio became more contemplative and personal. Elvis seemed to be using the familiar songs as warm-ups for something more challenging and emotionally demanding. At around 2:30 a.m., Elvis asked Felton Jarvis to clear the studio of all but essential personnel. This was unusual. Elvis typically enjoyed having friends and colleagues around during recording sessions, treating them as informal audiences who could provide immediate feedback on his performances. But for My Way, Elvis wanted privacy. He understood that what he was about to attempt would require complete emotional honesty, and he needed to know that he could be vulnerable without worrying about how his performance would be perceived or discussed outside the studio. The musicians who remained: James Burton on guitar, David Briggs on piano, Norbert Putnam on bass, and Kenneth Batre on drums, had all worked extensively with Elvis and understood his moods and working methods. They could provide the musical support he needed while respecting the emotional space he required for such a personal performance. Elvis spent nearly an hour working through the song's arrangement, experimenting with different tempos and approaches. Unlike Sinatra's confident, swaggering version, Elvis seemed drawn to a slower, more contemplative interpretation that would allow him to explore the song's emotional implications more deeply. Elvis was treating My Way like it was a piece of classical music. David Briggs later recalled, he wanted to understand every nuance, every emotional possibility. He kept asking us to play it different ways, trying to find the approach that would let him say exactly what he needed to say. The final arrangement that emerged was unlike anything Elvis had ever recorded. The tempo was deliberately slow, almost mournful, with spaces between phrases that allowed each line to carry maximum emotional weight. The instrumentation was spare and supportive, providing a foundation for Elvis's voice without distracting from the song's message. When Elvis finally felt ready to record, the atmosphere in the studio became almost reverent. Everyone present understood that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Elvis Presley examining his own life and career with the kind of honesty that he had never displayed publicly. The performance that followed was devastating in its emotional intensity. Elvis's voice, which had been powerful and controlled during earlier songs that evening, became vulnerable and sometimes hesitant as he worked through the song's autobiographical implications. Each verse seemed to unlock different memories and regrets. When he sang about facing challenges, his voice carried the weight of every criticism he had endured, every obstacle he had overcome. When he addressed his regrets, the pain in his voice was so palpable that several of the musicians found themselves struggling to maintain their concentration. But it was during the song's climactic moments, when the lyrics spoke about approaching the end of life with dignity and acceptance, that Elvis's performance became almost unbearably personal. His voice broke with emotion as he confronted the possibility that his greatest achievements might also represent his greatest limitations, that the success that had given him everything might have also cost him the possibility of a truly authentic life. The recording session ended in silence. When Elvis finished the song, no one in the studio spoke for several minutes. The performance had been so intensely personal that responding seemed almost like an invasion of privacy. Elvis himself was visibly shaken. According to Felton Jarvis, who documented the session in his private notes, Elvis sat quietly in the vocal booth for nearly half an hour, seemingly processing what he had just revealed about himself through the song. "I've never heard Elvis sing anything like that," Jarvis wrote in his journal that night. "It wasn't just a performance. It was like listening to someone's confession, their deepest fears and regrets laid bare through music. I don't know if the world is ready to hear Elvis that vulnerable and honest." When Elvis finally emerged from the vocal booth, his first words were about protecting the recording. He was adamant that the performance should not be released, at least not during his lifetime. The song revealed too much, made him too vulnerable, exposed aspects of his personality and experience that he wasn't ready to share with the public. "This is between me and the song," Elvis told the assembled musicians. "Some things are too personal to sell." The decision to vault My Way revealed Elvis's complicated relationship with his own artistry. Throughout his career, he had struggled with the tension between authentic self-expression and commercial success, between revealing his true self and maintaining the image that had made him wealthy and famous. My Way represented the ultimate test of this tension. The song demanded complete honesty, but honesty had never been part of Elvis's commercial appeal. Audiences loved Elvis for his energy, his sexuality, his ability to make them feel good about themselves and the world. They didn't necessarily want to hear about his doubts, his regrets, or his fears about the choices he had made. The recording also revealed Elvis's growing awareness that his career had been shaped more by external forces than by his own desires and decisions. While My Way celebrated self-determination and personal responsibility, Elvis's professional life had been largely controlled by Colonel Parker's business decisions and RCA's commercial priorities. Recording My Way forced Elvis to confront the gap between the song's message of personal autonomy and his own experience of being managed, packaged, and marketed according to other people's visions of what Elvis Presley should be. The impact of the My Way recording session extended far beyond that single night in Nashville. According to those closest to him, the experience of performing the song with complete honesty changed Elvis's perspective on his career and his personal life. Priscilla Presley, who learned about the recording session from Elvis himself, later described his emotional reaction in her memoir. "Elvis came home from Nashville different," she wrote. "He had always been introspective, but after recording My Way, he seemed to be questioning everything about his life and career. The song had forced him to confront truths about himself that he hadn't been ready to face." The recording session also influenced Elvis's approach to live performances. While he never performed My Way in its entirety during his Las Vegas shows, elements of the song's emotional honesty began appearing in his interpretations of other material. Musicians who worked with Elvis during this period noticed a change in his vocal approach. He became more willing to explore the emotional depths of songs, less concerned with maintaining the safe distance that had characterized much of his earlier work. After the My Way session, Elvis started singing like someone who had nothing to hide, observed James Burton. He was still the same powerful performer, but there was a vulnerability in his voice that hadn't been there before. It was like he had given himself permission to be completely honest through his music. The existence of the My Way recording became one of the music industry's most closely guarded secrets. Only a handful of people knew that Elvis had actually recorded the song, and even fewer had heard the actual performance. RCA executives were aware of the recording's existence, but they respected Elvis's decision to keep it vaulted. The company had learned over the years that pushing Elvis to release material he wasn't comfortable with usually resulted in inferior performances and damaged relationships. But within the small circle of people who knew about My Way, the recording quickly gained legendary status. Those who had been present during the session spoke about it in hushed tones, describing it as possibly Elvis's greatest vocal performance and certainly his most emotionally revealing. Everyone who heard that recording knew they had witnessed something special, recalled engineer Al Pachucki, who worked on the session. It wasn't just a great song performance. It was a great human being, revealing his soul through music. That's something you don't hear very often, even in this business. The mystery surrounding Elvis's My Way recording deepened over the years, as various musicians and industry insiders made cryptic references to its existence, without providing specific details. The song became a sort of holy grail for Elvis collectors and biographers, a legendary performance that might or might not exist. Some claimed that Elvis had actually performed My Way during private gatherings at Graceland, treating it as a personal song that was too meaningful to commercialize. Others insisted that the 1971 recording was just one of several versions that Elvis had attempted over the years, each one too emotionally demanding to complete satisfactorily. The truth about Elvis's relationship with My Way was more complex than either of these theories suggested. The song had become a touchstone for his most honest self-examination, a piece of music that connected him to feelings and insights that he couldn't access through any other means. But it had also become a source of ongoing internal conflict. Part of Elvis wanted to share the recording with the world, to let people hear him at his most vulnerable and authentic. Another part of him understood that maintaining some privacy, some personal space that existed separate from his public image, was essential to his psychological well-being. the question of whether to release My Way became a recurring theme in Elvis's later career discussions. According to Jerry Schilling, who served as Elvis's close friend and occasional manager, Elvis would periodically mention the recording and wonder whether the time had come to let people hear it. Elvis knew that My Way was probably his best vocal performance, Schilling observed in a 1995 interview, but he also knew that releasing it would change how people saw him. Once you let people hear you that vulnerable, that honest, you can't take it back. Elvis wasn't sure he was ready for that level of exposure. The internal debate about My Way reflected Elvis's broader struggles with authenticity and performance during his final years. The success of his Las Vegas residencies had proven that audiences still loved Elvis Presley, the entertainer, but it had also trapped him in a cycle of increasingly predictable performances that provided little personal satisfaction. Elvis began to talk more frequently about wanting to challenge himself artistically, to take risks that would prove his growth as a performer and as a person. My Way represented the ultimate artistic risk, a performance so personal that it could either elevate his artistic reputation or damage his commercial appeal. But Elvis also understood that his career had reached a point where artistic risks carried enormous financial implications. The Las Vegas residencies generated millions of dollars in revenue, not just for Elvis, but for Colonel Parker, RCA, and the International Hotel itself. Releasing a recording that might confuse or alienate audiences could jeopardize an entire economic ecosystem that depended on Elvis maintaining his established image. The tension between artistic integrity and commercial stability became increasingly difficult for Elvis to navigate as he entered the mid-1970s. His health was beginning to decline due to the pressures of constant performing and prescription drug use, making the emotional demands of completely honest performances even more challenging. Yet, My Way continued to haunt him. Friends reported that Elvis would sometimes play the song on piano during quiet moments at Graceland, working through its emotional implications in private, while avoiding the vulnerability that full vocal performance would require. Elvis carried My Way with him like a secret, observed Linda Thompson, who was Elvis's companion during much of the 1970s. You could tell that the song meant something special to him, that it connected him to feelings and insights that he couldn't share with anyone else. But it also seemed to make him sad, like it reminded him of choices he had made or opportunities he had missed. The sadness that Thompson observed may have come from Elvis's recognition that My Way represented both his greatest artistic achievement and his greatest artistic limitation. He had created a performance of unprecedented emotional honesty, but he couldn't share it without risking the carefully constructed public image that had sustained his career. This paradox, creating art too authentic to release, captured the essential tragedy of Elvis's later career. He had become so successful, so iconic, that complete honesty had become commercially dangerous. The very authenticity that had made him famous had become something he could no longer afford to display publicly. The story of Elvis's My Way recording took on additional poignancy after his death in August 1977. The existence of the unreleased recording became part of the larger mythology surrounding Elvis's artistic legacy, evidence of depths and complexities that the public had never been allowed to see. Various Elvis biographers and researchers attempted to track down the recording, hoping to include it in posthumous releases or at least to document its contents for historical purposes. But RCA and the Presley estate maintained strict control over Elvis's unreleased material, particularly recordings that Elvis himself had specifically requested be kept private. The respect for Elvis's wishes regarding My Way said something important about how those closest to him understood his relationship with the song. This wasn't simply a matter of commercial calculation or artistic quality control. It was about honoring Elvis's desire to maintain some aspects of his creative life as purely personal expressions. In the decades following Elvis's death, My Way took on symbolic significance beyond its importance as an unreleased recording. The song came to represent everything that Elvis might have accomplished artistically if he had been free to take greater creative risks, to explore the full range of his emotional and vocal abilities without worrying about commercial consequences. Music critics and Elvis scholars began to discuss My Way as a lost masterpiece, a recording that could have redefined Elvis's artistic legacy if he had been brave enough or free enough to release it during his lifetime. But this interpretation may have missed the point of why Elvis recorded My Way in the first place. The song wasn't created as a commercial product or even as an artistic statement intended for public consumption. It was Elvis's attempt to understand himself, to examine his life and choices through the discipline of musical performance. In that sense, My Way succeeded completely, regardless of whether it was ever released. The recording gave Elvis a vehicle for self-examination that he couldn't find anywhere else, a moment of complete honesty that existed separate from the demands of his public career. The current location of Elvis's My Way recording remains officially undisclosed, though it is believed to reside in the Sony Music Archives, RCA's successor company, along with thousands of other Elvis recordings and alternate takes. Occasional rumors surface about plans to include My Way in comprehensive Elvis box sets or special releases, but the Presley estate has maintained its policy of respecting Elvis's original wishes regarding the recording's privacy. This decision to continue protecting My Way reflects a deeper understanding of what the Presley recording represented for Elvis personally. It wasn't just another song in his catalog, it was a moment of complete vulnerability that he chose to keep private during his lifetime. The legacy of Elvis's My Way recording extends beyond its status as unreleased material to encompass broader questions about artistic authenticity, commercial pressure, and the relationship between public personas and private truth. For contemporary artists who face similar pressures to maintain marketable images while pursuing authentic self-expression, Elvis's struggle with My Way offers both inspiration and caution. The recording proves that complete artistic honesty is possible, but it also demonstrates the personal cost of such honesty when it conflicts with commercial expectations. The story of My Way also illuminates the complexity of Elvis's artistic legacy. While he is often remembered primarily for his early rock and roll innovations or his Las Vegas spectaculars, the unreleased recording suggests depths and complexities that the public never fully experienced. In the end, Elvis's My Way recording represents something unique in popular music history, a performance so personal that its creator chose to keep it private, valuing its emotional truth more than its commercial potential. The song that Frank Sinatra used to celebrate a life lived on his own terms became, for Elvis Presley, a meditation on the costs of fame, the difficulty of authentic self-expression, and the courage required to examine one's life with complete honesty. That Elvis chose to keep this examination private doesn't diminish its importance. It may actually enhance it. In an era when privacy has become almost impossible for public figures, Elvis's decision to protect My Way from commercial exploitation represents a final act of artistic integrity. The recording remains locked away, a secret between Elvis and the song that revealed too much truth for the world to hear. But the story of its creation offers insights into the man behind the legend, the artist behind the entertainer, and the human being who struggled to balance authenticity with the demands of being Elvis Presley. Sometimes, the most important art is the art that never gets shared. the moments of complete honesty that exist purely for their creator's understanding and growth. Elvis Presley's My Way recording represents exactly that kind of art, too personal to release, too important to forget, and too powerful to exist anywhere except in the private space where legends confront their own humanity.